Constitution-class refit, a beauty to behold. A lovingly updated design for the big screen, fandom would yearn to know more about this amazing class of starship. And Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise would satisfy that craving, and more. Hello and welcome to another episode of Truth or Myth Beta Canon, a Star Trek web series that dives into the history of any given topic, using beta canon sources and my own imagination to fill in the gaps. In today's episode, we're taking a look at Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise, one of my favorite beta canon reference sources, to better understand its place in Star Trek history. As always, because Mr. Scott's Guide is beta canon only, all information relayed should pretty much be taken with a grain of stardust, and only considered a little bit of Star Trek fun. And so, with all that out of the way, let's begin. A while back, I made a video on Franz Joseph's Starfleet Technical Manual, and you good trinaries seem to really enjoy that video, so I thought I'd branch out a little and give you a taste of another one of my favorite manuals, Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise, which, in my younger days, I pre-ordered and eagerly awaited for its release. Published July 1st, 1987, and sitting at 128 pages in length, created by Shane Johnson, this in-depth guide to the starship occupied most of my imagination for a very long time. Shane Johnson would eventually become Lora Johnson after undergoing a gender transition. A Trekkie from the moment Star Trek the Original Series made its resurgence in syndication, Johnson got her start in the Star Trek universe by creating fanfiction blueprints and schematics before she was hired on by Pocket Books. In 2008, after being diagnosed with several life-threatening health issues, Johnson dropped out of the public's eye, and very little has been heard from her since. But she would leave 4 Star Trek-specific works of brilliant art for fandom to drool over: the Starfleet Uniform Recognition Manual, the Worlds of the Federation, another favorite of mine, the Star Trek The Next Generation Technical Journal, and of course, Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise. This guide had everything a fan could want. It was a deck-by-deck thorough examination of the Enterprise, which included everything from room blueprints to uniform diagrams. Truly a marvel of fascinating detail. Though primarily published in English, released in the US, Canada, and UK, there was actually one other international release, translated to Portuguese and released in Brazil, though this Brazilian edition would radically change the cover of the manual and listed as an aid for Star Trek-themed RPG games. Johnson, like so many Trek lovers of the time, was a huge fan of Franz Joseph's Star Trek blueprints, the basis for the Starfleet Technical Manual. And so Johnson approached Pocket Books in 1985 with a proposal to draft a similar set of blueprints based on the USS Enterprise as seen in the first 3 Star Trek movies. Pocket Books declined her offer, but due to the success of the Joseph Starfleet Technical Manual, countered with an offer that she could write a similar manual instead, and eventually Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise would be born. Mr. Scott's Guide was published shortly after the release of Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, and as a result, this manual would include a special section on the newly commissioned Enterprise A, receiving input from longtime Star Trek production staffers Andrew Probert, co-designer of the refit Enterprise, and Mike Okuda, who served as technical consultant on the book. Like I said, fans were hungry for Star Trek reference materials, and as a result, we were all eagerly awaiting this manual's release. So anticipated was this manual that Pocket Books had to increase its initial run of the guide from 30,000 to 60,000 copies, just to cover all the advanced sales. Of course, Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise is far from perfect. In fact, there is a lot of little details that have long since been proven incorrect or contradictory by Alpha Canon itself. Take for example the class's name. In canon we know it to be the Constitution class refit. But in this guide, it refers to the class as the Enterprise class. And being young at the time of the guide's release, I was more than willing to accept that as fact. Of course, decades later, I now know better. But there are still those fans out there that will fight to the death over the class's name, not willing to accept the truth of the matter for what it is. Also, this manual refers to the origins of the Enterprise A, declaring that the USS Tahoe, not the Tahoe, like some of my American channel fans thought the ship's name was in one of my previous videos. Apparently, the USS Tahoe was built from the ground up to test another version of transwarp drive, with the Excelsior class test being supposedly successful. Well, canon has proven that particular experiment in transwarp by the Excelsior to be a complete failure. As in TNG times, starships are still traveling around at warp speed, and ships like Voyager are trying to create a transwarp drive. And before anyone starts furiously typing in the comment section that the reason that the transwarp experiment failed was because of Scotty's sabotage of the Excelsior, I have to inform you that you are incorrect. In Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home, during the court-martial scene, the crew of the Enterprise is charged with the sabotage of the USS Excelsior, which means Starfleet knew Scotty had sabotaged the ship. After all, they couldn't charge our intrepid crew with a crime if they didn't know about it. And if they knew about it, then they would have simply repaired the damage done by Mr. Scott and the trial runs would continue. But as if this discrepancy in transwarp the Enterprise A wasn't enough, Gene Roddenberry himself would throw a huge wrinkle into the beta canon space-time continuum, causing an anomaly still felt today, as he would declare that it was the USS Yorktown that became the Enterprise A, and not the Tahoe. And as always, some fans will still argue that point to the death. Even transwarp itself would receive an incorrect description of how it worked. Using the TOS episode The Tholian Web as its inspiration, it would function by shifting a vessel with transwarp through a spatial interface into a parallel continuum, in which the USS Defiant was lost. The book even makes use of the FASA naming and dating scheme, placing the vessel's refit in the early 23rd century, something we now know to be far from canon. But even with all its discrepancies, it's still a valuable guide on so many levels. With accurate layouts of virtually every set shown in the first 3 movies, Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise is truly a treasure to behold. As a teenager, I'd often get lost in those schematics, closing my eyes and able to picture where everything in every room was. And what Star Trek fan doesn't love those kind of little details? And although my copy of the manual has certainly seen better days, it's still actually holding up quite well, probably better than I am. And I'd like to just take a moment here to extend a huge thank you to Lora Johnson for her amazing work. And if by chance, Lora, you ever come across this video, I want you to know how much you influenced me throughout my younger days, and how important your work truly was to me. Thank you so much, and I wish you peace and long life. So if you ever have a chance to pick up this little gem, perhaps from a local used bookstore at bargain basement prices, I highly recommend that you do so. It's well worth its inclusion in any Star Trek fan's personal library, even if it's just to browse through on occasion, and dream of the final frontier on board the USS Enterprise, boldly going where no imagination has gone before. Thank you for watching today's episode of Truth or Myth Beta Canon. What do you think of Mr. Scott's Guide to the Enterprise? Do you want to see more videos on other reference materials and their histories that I've collected throughout the ages? Well then, leave your comments in the section below. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. hitting that little bell icon so you won't miss a single video we release. Want to help Mr. Scott refit this channel? Then consider becoming a channel patron. The link to our Patreon account is in the description below. Thanks again for watching. Live long and prosper.